The morning sun peeked through the blinds of Kristen Welker's office at the NBC headquarters in New York City. Kristen sat at her desk, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her as she flipped through a thick folder of research materials. Today was an important day. In just 4 hours, she would be interviewing Karoline Leavitt, one of the most outspoken political spokespersons in the current administration. Kristen ran her finger down a list of prepared questions, making small marks with her pen. She had been in the business for over 15 years, and she knew when an interview had the potential to make headlines. This was definitely one of those times. Knock, knock, a voice came from the doorway. Jack Miller, her producer, entered, carrying his own stack of papers. "How's the prep going?" "Almost there," Kristen replied, not looking up from her notes. "I'm just finalizing which angle to take on the border policy questions." Jack set his materials down and took a seat across from her. "The network executives called again this morning. They're nervous about this one." Kristen finally looked up, her expression serious. "They're always nervous these days. Our ratings dropped 8% last quarter. They want something that will get people talking." "And Leavitt is known for creating moments," Jack said with a nod. "But we need to be careful. The criticism about our coverage has been getting louder. Social media is full of claims that we're biased." Kristen tapped her pen against the desk. "I'm not here to please social media, Jack. I'm here to ask the tough questions that need asking." Jack leaned forward. "I know, and that's why you're the best. But remember, stay focused on policy questions. We don't want this turning into a shouting match about personalities." Kristen nodded, though her mind was already working on how to frame her questions about the former president. There was one statement in particular that had dominated the news cycle for days, and she knew viewers would expect her to address it. Outside the building, Karoline Leavitt stepped out of a black SUV, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I've reviewed all the briefing materials," she said to the person on the other end. "I know exactly what they're going to ask." Nancy Carter, Karoline's communications advisor, was waiting in the lobby. As soon as Karoline entered, Nancy guided her toward a private room the network had provided for their preparation. "The NBC team has been pushing hard on the statement from last week," Nancy said once they were alone. "Our sources say Welker has been instructed to get a reaction from you that they can run in promos." Karoline smiled slightly as she set down her bag. "They always want the same thing, a clip they can play over and over without context." "Exactly," Nancy agreed, opening her laptop. "So we need to be ready. They'll try to corner you, especially on the Trump question. The statement about international alliances has been played on every channel, but always cut off before the explanation." Karoline took a seat, smoothing her dark blue blazer. "We have the full transcript, correct?" "Right here," Nancy confirmed, passing her a folder. "Page 3 has the complete statement with the parts they never air highlighted. I think you should have this with you during the interview, just in case." Karoline reviewed the document, her eyes narrowing as she read. "They've been showing the first part where he criticizes the treaty, but conveniently cutting it off before he explains the alternative approach." "Classic selective editing," Nancy said. "They're painting it as a rejection of allies rather than a call for renegotiation." Karoline closed the folder, her decision made. "I'll bring this with me. If Welker tries to use that edited clip as a gotcha moment, I'll be ready." Back in her office, Kristen was meeting with the rest of her team. Tim Rogers, the research assistant, was updating her on the latest developments. Leavitt gave 3 interviews last week, and in each one she avoided directly addressing the statement, Tim explained. She pivoted to talking about economic policy. "Each time, she won't be able to pivot with me," Kristen said confidently. "I need that clip ready to play, the one from the rally in Ohio." "Already loaded into the system," confirmed Lily Patel, the technical director. "We can pull it up on screen when you give the signal." Kristen nodded. "Good, we'll start with infrastructure and the new bill. Let her get comfortable. Then education policy, border security, and about 30 minutes in, we'll bring up the statement." "The network is heavily promoting this interview," Jack reminded everyone. "Online ads, radio spots, the works. They're calling it a must-watch conversation." Kristen understood the pressure. Her last few interviews had been criticized as too soft by some and too aggressive by others. In the current political climate, it seemed impossible to please everyone. But she had built her career on being fair and persistent, and she wasn't about to change her approach now. 1 hour until she arrives, Jack announced, checking his watch. Let's go through the run of show one more time. As the team reviewed the schedule, in another part of the building, the studio was being prepared. Greg White, the lead technician, was checking the lighting while his colleague Susan Peters tested the microphones. Heard this one might get heated, Greg said as he adjusted a light. Susan nodded. That's the word going around. Welker's been prepping all week, and I heard Leavitt brought her own media team. $10 says someone walks off before it's over, Greg joked. No bet, Susan replied with a laugh. Though I hope not. Last time that happened, we had to scramble to fill 20 minutes of airtime. The studio was designed to create an intimate setting despite the cameras and lights. 2 chairs were positioned at angles that would allow both faces to be clearly visible to viewers, with a small table between them for notes or water glasses. Karoline and Nancy arrived at the studio entrance 45 minutes before the scheduled start. They were met by a production assistant who led them to the green room. Ms. Welker will come by to say hello before you go on air, the assistant explained. Can I get you anything while you wait? Just water, thank you, Karoline replied politely. Once they were alone again, she turned to Nancy. Did you see how many staff members were rushing around? They're treating this like it's the Super Bowl of interviews. That's because for them it is, Nancy said. Their ratings need a boost and they think you might provide it. Karoline took a deep breath, centering herself. Then let's make sure we give people something worth watching, but on our terms, not theirs. In her dressing room, Kristen was going through her final preparations. Her hair and makeup were done and she was reviewing her notes one last time. There was a knock at the door and Jack entered. 5-minute warning, he said. How are you feeling? Ready? Kristen answered, standing up and straightening her jacket. Let's go say hello to our guest. As Kristen walked down the hallway toward the green room, she mentally shifted into interview mode. This wasn't personal. It was about getting to the truth, about asking the questions the public wanted answered. It was about doing her job. The moment when interviewer and subject first meet before cameras roll is always interesting. Both sides sizing each other up, both wearing professional smiles that reveal nothing of their true thoughts. Kristen extended her hand as she entered the green room. Ms. Leavitt, thank you for joining us today, she said warmly. Karoline stood and shook her hand firmly. Thank you for having me, Ms. Welker. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Their eyes met briefly, each woman trying to read the other's intentions. Both were seasoned professionals who had been in this position many times before. Both knew that what happened in the next hour could potentially be replayed on news channels and social media for days to come. We'll be starting in about 3 minutes, Kristen said. They'll come get you shortly. Perfect, Karoline replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm all set. As Kristen left to take her position, in the studio, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before every important interview. This was why she had become a journalist. For moments like these when questions could lead to answers that mattered. Little did she know that this particular interview would become one of the most talked about broadcasts of her career, for reasons she couldn't yet imagine. The red light on camera 1 blinked to life as the floor director silently counted down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The on-air sign glowed bright above the studio door, and the monitors around the room displayed the NBC logo before, cutting to Kristen Welker's composed face. Good evening and welcome to tonight's special broadcast, Kristen said, looking directly into the camera. Her voice was steady and professional. I'm Kristen Welker, and tonight we're joined by Karoline Leavitt, who serves as the Senior Communications Advisor to the administration. Thank you for being here, Ms. Leavitt. The camera panned to show both women sitting across from each other in comfortable-looking blue chairs. The studio lighting cast a soft glow that made them both look polished and camera-ready. Thank you for having me, Kristen, Karoline replied with a slight nod. She sat with perfect posture, her hands resting lightly on her lap, A small American flag pin adorned her lapel, catching the light when she moved. Kristen glanced down at her notes briefly. Let's begin with the infrastructure bill that passed last week. Your office has called it a major victory, but critics say it doesn't go far enough to address aging bridges and roads in rural areas. How do you respond to that? This was an easy starting question, designed to get the conversation flowing naturally before moving to more difficult topics. It was a standard interview technique that Kristen had used hundreds of times. Karoline smiled, clearly prepared for this opener. The American Infrastructure Renewal Act is the largest investment in our nation's infrastructure in 30 years. It dedicates 60% of funds specifically to rural communities that have been overlooked for decades. Critics who claim it doesn't go far enough are often the same voices who oppose the bill entirely during its development. In the control room, Jack Miller watched the monitors carefully. Both women appeared relaxed but focused. "Audio levels good?" he asked the sound engineer. "Perfect," the young woman replied, adjusting a dial slightly. "Both mics are picking up clearly." Back in the studio, Kristen followed up with questions about specific funding allocations, and Karoline answered each one with detailed numbers and statistics. The first 10 minutes proceeded smoothly, with the conversation flowing naturally between topics. Greg White, standing near camera 2, whispered to Susan Peters, Welker's easing in gently. "Smart move." Susan nodded. "Leavitt's comfortable talking about infrastructure. Wait until they hit the more controversial stuff." As if on cue, Kristen shifted the conversation. "Let's move to education policy. The administration has proposed significant changes to federal student loan programs. Many educators have expressed concern about what this means for college accessibility. What assurances can you provide that these changes won't disproportionately affect lower-income students?" A subtle change came over Karoline's expression. Not quite tension, but increased alertness. She leaned forward slightly. "I'm glad you brought this up because there's been a lot of misunderstanding about our approach. The current system has led to skyrocketing tuition costs while saddling young Americans with debt they can't manage. Our reforms actually increase grant funding for low-income students by 22%, while creating more accountability for institutions that raise tuition beyond inflation rates." As Karoline continued explaining the policy, Kristen made occasional notes. The camera occasionally cut to show Kristen's thoughtful expression, then back to Karoline as she spoke. To viewers at home, it looked like a standard political interview, professional, slightly formal but cordial. In the production booth, Jack received a message on his tablet. "Ratings are good," he told the team around him. "Social media engagement starting to pick up." 20 minutes into the interview, Kristen moved to immigration policy. Border security has been a cornerstone of the administration's platform, yet recent data shows that processing times for asylum seekers have increased by 30%. How do you reconcile the promise of a more efficient system with these delays? For the first time, a flash of irritation crossed Karoline's face, though it quickly disappeared. "I appreciate the question, but I need to correct something in your framing. The data you're referring to doesn't account for the massive increase in applications we're processing. When you look at the per-case efficiency, we've actually improved processing speed by 15%. The total wait time is longer because we're handling triple the number of cases compared to the previous administration." Kristen nodded, making another note. "Let me follow up on that point. Critics suggest that the increased number of applications is directly related to the administration's public statements, which some interpret as welcoming undocumented entry. How would you respond?" The temperature in the conversation noticeably shifted. Karoline's smile remained in place, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I would say those critics are deliberately mischaracterizing statements that have consistently emphasized legal immigration while discouraging illegal border crossings. What we're seeing is the result of global instability that began long before this administration took office." In the control room, Jack leaned forward in his chair. "Here we go," he said quietly. "She's getting defensive." The floor director made a subtle gesture to camera 3, which moved to capture both women in profile, highlighting the growing tension between them. Kristen pressed further. But wouldn't you agree that words matter? That statements from high-ranking officials can be interpreted as policy signals by those considering migration? Words absolutely matter, Karoline replied, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Which is why we should be precise about what was actually said rather than relying on out-of-context interpretations. The administration has been crystal clear about supporting legal pathways while enforcing consequences for illegal entry. The exchange continued for several minutes, with Kristen asking follow-up questions and Karoline providing increasingly detailed defenses of the administration's position. Neither woman raised her voice, but viewers could sense the undercurrent of tension building. In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their screens. This was becoming more interesting than the typical political interview where talking points were simply recited without challenge. "She's good," Susan whispered to Greg as they watched from the side of the studio. "Leavitt isn't taking the bait to get emotional." Greg nodded. "Welker's not backing down either. She's going to keep pushing until she gets something camera-worthy." As the interview approached the 30-minute mark, Kristen smoothly transitioned to a new topic. "I'd like to discuss international relations now. Last week, there was significant reaction to statements made about America's role in global alliances." Karoline's posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Those who knew her well would recognize she was now on high alert. This was the moment she had prepared for extensively with Nancy. "Before we dive into that," Kristen continued, "let's listen to what was said at the rally in Ohio last week." She turned slightly toward the studio monitor where a clip began to play. The video showed a crowded rally with the former president speaking at a podium. "These international agreements are taking advantage of America. We're paying billions while other countries contribute almost nothing. It's time to walk away from these one-sided deals that hurt American workers." The clip ended, and Kristen turned back to Karoline. "That statement has raised concerns among our allies about America's commitment to international cooperation. How does the administration justify this position?" The studio grew very quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. This was the moment the network had been promoting, the question they hoped would create a memorable television moment. Karoline looked directly at Kristen, her expression calm but intent. "I'm glad you played that clip, Kristen. But I notice it ended rather abruptly. There were several more minutes to that speech that provided important context about renegotiating, rather than abandoning our international commitments." Kristen maintained her professional demeanor. "The key concern from our allies relates specifically to the phrase "walk away from these one-sided deals." That suggests termination rather than renegotiation." "Context matters," Karoline replied, her voice firm but controlled. And in the full speech, which lasted nearly an hour, it was made very clear that the goal is to create more equitable arrangements where all nations contribute their fair share. Isolating a 7-second clip does a disservice to viewers who deserve to understand the complete position. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Camera 1 zoomed in slightly on Kristen's face as she prepared her next question. Camera 2 did the same with Karoline. In control rooms and living rooms across the country, people sensed that the polite veneer of the interview was about to crack. Kristen glanced at her notes. "Let me ask you directly then. Is the administration prepared to withdraw from international alliances if their terms aren't renegotiated to your satisfaction?" Karoline's eyes narrowed just slightly. She reached for the folder she had brought with her and placed it on her lap. "That's a leading question based on an incomplete premise," she said, her voice still measured but with a new edge of challenge. "And it brings me to a larger concern about how this issue has been covered by certain media outlets." Karoline opened the folder on her lap and pulled out several sheets of paper. The studio lights reflected off the white pages as she looked directly at Kristen. "For the past week, your network and others have played that 7-second clip over and over," Karoline said, her voice calm but firm. "But not once have I seen the full context shown to viewers." Kristen shifted slightly in her chair. "We played the key statement that has caused concern among our allies." "With respect," Karoline interrupted, something she had not done until this point in the interview. "That's exactly the problem I want to address. What you call the key statement is actually part of a longer explanation that completely changes the meaning when heard in full." In the control room, Jack leaned forward and spoke into his microphone. "Stay on both of them, camera 3. This is getting good." Back in the studio, Kristen tried to regain control of the conversation. "Perhaps you could clarify the administration's position then?" "I'd be happy to," Karoline replied, looking down at the papers in her hand. "But first, I think it's important for your viewers to hear what was said immediately after the clip you played." She began to read from the transcript. The former president said, and I quote, "Walking away from bad deals doesn't mean walking away from our allies. It means sitting down at the table as equals to create new agreements that respect American workers while strengthening our global partnerships. We don't want to abandon our friends. We want fair treatment for all nations involved." Karoline looked up from the paper. "That part never makes it to air on NBC. I have to wonder why. The atmosphere in the studio changed completely. What had been subtle tension was now open confrontation." Kristen's expression remained professional, but a slight flush appeared on her cheeks. "Our reporting aims to highlight the most newsworthy elements," Kristen began. "Is context not newsworthy?" Karoline asked. Her tone wasn't angry or raised, which somehow made the challenge even more powerful. "I find it interesting that the most newsworthy elements always seem to be the ones that create controversy, rather than the ones that provide understanding." In the control room, Jack turned to his assistant director. "Tell Welker to pivot back to the question about allies," he said urgently. The message was relayed through Kristen's earpiece. She nodded slightly and tried another approach. "The concern from our European partners remains that, let me address those concerns directly," Karoline said, again not allowing Kristen to finish her thought. "I speak with our European counterparts weekly. Their public statements may express concern because that's diplomacy. But in private, many acknowledge that funding inequalities have existed for decades and need to be addressed." She looked directly into the camera. "What Americans deserve to know is that we're not threatening alliances. We're strengthening them by making them more sustainable for all countries involved." Turning back to Kristen, she continued, "But that doesn't make for exciting headlines, does it?" The camera captured Kristen's expression as she realized this interview was not going as planned. Instead of Karoline becoming defensive or emotional, she was methodically turning the tables. "Ms. Leavitt," Kristen said, her voice slightly firmer, "now, our job as journalists is to ask tough questions that the public wants answered." "Absolutely," Karoline agreed with a nod. "And my job is to make sure the public gets complete answers, not just the parts that fit a predetermined narrative." From his position near camera 2, Greg whispered to Susan, "I've never seen anyone take control like this. Welker is losing her grip on the interview." Susan nodded. "Production is probably freaking out right now." She was right. In the control room, Jack was becoming increasingly agitated. "Tell her to cut this off and move to the economy questions," he said into his headset. On set, Kristen received the message and tried to change direction. "Let's move on to discuss economic policies." "I'm happy to discuss any topic," Karoline said pleasantly, "but I think we should finish this one first. Your viewers deserve the complete picture." She turned a page in her folder. "I've brought some interesting data about how this issue has been covered in the media. Over the past week, that 7-second clip has been played on your network 43 times. The full context that I just read? 0 times. Alan Brown, one of the production assistants standing at the edge of the studio, later described what happened next as the most controlled takedown I've ever witnessed on live television." Karoline continued, her voice never rising but her words landing with precision. "This isn't just about one statement or one policy. It's about a pattern of selective reporting that shapes public perception without providing genuine understanding." She looked directly at Kristen. "Americans are smart enough to form their own opinions when given all the facts, don't you agree?" The question hung in the air. It was brilliantly constructed. To disagree would suggest Kristen didn't trust viewers with complete information, but to agree would be admitting to the criticism Karoline had just leveled. Kristen paused for a moment, then attempted to redirect. "Our coverage aims to be fair and balanced. Then let me ask you this, Karoline said, still calm but relentless. Why hasn't your network interviewed any of the European ministers who have publicly supported the call for more equitable funding? There have been statements from officials in Poland, Italy, and the UK that align with our position. Have any of them been invited on this show? In the control room, panic was setting in. This was not the gotcha moment they had hoped for. Instead, their own journalistic practices were being questioned on live television. Cut to commercial, Jack said urgently. Now. But on set, Kristen decided to stand her ground. We've covered a wide range of perspectives on this issue. I've watched your coverage every day this week, Karoline replied. 27 different guests discussed this topic. Not one represented the viewpoint I just described. Does that sound like a wide range of perspectives to you? The studio was completely silent, except for their voices. Even the camera operators seemed frozen in place, not wanting to miss a moment of this unexpected confrontation. Kristen's earpiece was now buzzing with urgent messages from the control room, but she tried one more time to reassert control. That's not a fair characterization of our reporting. I have the data right here, Karoline responded, tapping her folder. Names, dates, segments, all easily verifiable. Would you like me to share this information with your viewers? She wasn't angry or accusatory. Her tone remained reasonable and calm. But her words were devastating because they contained specific facts that would be difficult to dispute on live television. Kristen felt the interview slipping further away from her. This was supposed to be about challenging the administration's policies, not defending her network's journalistic practices. We stand by our coverage, Kristen said firmly. But let's return to the actual policies we were discussing. The policies and how they're covered are directly connected, Karoline replied. When Americans only hear part of the story, how can they properly evaluate the policies themselves? In the control room, Jack was now standing, speaking forcefully into his microphone. We need to break now. The message finally reached Kristen, who made a quick decision. She turned to the camera and said, We'll take a quick break and continue this discussion after these messages. Before Karoline could respond, Kristen was already removing her microphone. The red light on camera 1 blinked off as they cut to commercial. Karoline sat calmly in her chair, still holding her folder of research. She had prepared for this moment for days, anticipating exactly how the interview would go and how she would respond. What she hadn't expected was for Kristen to actually leave the set. As Kristen walked quickly off camera, the studio erupted in frantic activity. Production assistants rushed around, speaking urgently into headsets. The floor director looked stunned, unsure what to do next. Viewers at home were left with the jarring transition from intense interview to sudden commercial break. On social media, comments were already flooding in, most of them asking variations of the same question. What just happened? No one in the studio could answer that question yet, but everyone knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented in political interviews. A complete reversal of who was asking the tough questions and who was being held accountable for their answers. The commercial for a new car played on screens across America, while chaos erupted behind the scenes at NBC studios. Kristen Welker marched quickly down the hallway toward the production office, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Jack Miller rushed after her, leaving the control room in disarray. What happened out there? Jack asked as he caught up to her. Kristen spun around. She ambushed me, Jack. She came prepared with research on our coverage and flipped the entire interview. We need to get you back on set, Jack said urgently. We have 4 minutes of commercials and then we're live again. Kristen shook her head. I'm not going back out there to be picked apart. She has a folder full of data about our reporting. This isn't what we prepared for. In the green room, Nancy Carter watched the situation unfold on a monitor. She couldn't hide her smile as she texted someone on her phone. It's working exactly as planned. Kay is brilliant. Back on the set, Karoline remained seated calmly, taking a sip of water as technicians rushed around her. The floor director approached hesitantly. Ms. Leavitt, we're having some technical difficulties. We'll resume shortly. Karoline nodded. Of course, is Ms. Welker okay? She seemed upset. The floor director didn't know how to respond. This wasn't a scenario covered in any production manual. She's just consulting with our producers, standard procedure during commercial breaks. Meanwhile, in Jack's office, an emergency meeting was taking place. Kristen stood with her arms crossed while Jack spoke with Denise Ford, the executive producer, on speakerphone. "We can't just leave an empty chair," Denise said, her voice tense. "We promoted this interview all week." "She came ready for war, Denise," Kristen replied. "She has statistics about our coverage that make us look biased. If I go back out there, she'll just continue dismantling us on our own network." Jack paced the small office. "We have 3 minutes until we're back live. We need a decision now." Denise's voice crackled through the phone. "Jack, get Paul Harris to fill in. He's experienced enough to handle this. Tell him to steer the conversation to economic policy and stay far away from the alliance issue." "What about me?" Kristen asked, still clearly upset. "We'll say you were called away to an urgent breaking story," Denise replied. "It's not ideal, but it's better than you walking back into that ambush." Jack nodded and rushed out to find Paul, a senior correspondent who happened to be in the building preparing for the evening news. Kristen sank into a chair, replaying the interview in her mind and wondering how it had gone so wrong. On social media, the situation was exploding. The abrupt cut to commercial had not gone unnoticed, and viewers were speculating wildly about what had happened. A user with a large following posted, "Welker just walked off her own show after Leavitt called out NBC's biased coverage. Never seen anything like this." The hashtag #Welker walkout started trending within minutes. In the studio, Paul Harris was being quickly briefed as makeup artists powdered his forehead. He looked confused but professional as he straightened his tie. "So I'm just stepping in because of technical issues with Kristen's microphone?" he asked the floor director. "That's the official line," the man replied quietly. "Just go with it." On set, Karoline watched with interest as Paul was seated in Kristen's chair. She had expected pushback during the interview, but hadn't anticipated causing such disruption that a new host would be brought in. "Ms. Leavitt, I'm Paul Harris," he introduced himself quickly. "We're back on air in 30 seconds. We'll continue the interview focusing on economic policies." Karoline smiled politely. "Lovely to meet you, Paul. Is Kristen feeling all right?" Before he could answer, the floor director began counting down. 5, 4, 3. He pointed silently for the last 2 counts, and the red light on camera 1 blinked on. "Welcome back to our special interview," Paul said smoothly, as if this had been the plan all along. "I'm Paul Harris, joining Ms. Karoline Leavitt as we continue our discussion. Kristen Welker has been called away to cover a developing story." In living rooms across America, viewers exchanged confused glances. It was obvious something unusual had happened. The interview had been building to a dramatic confrontation, and suddenly there was a new host pretending everything was normal. Paul smiled at Karoline. "Let's shift our focus to economic policies. The administration has proposed significant tax changes that would affect corporate rates. Can you explain how these would impact job creation?" Karoline nodded, seamlessly transitioning to the new topic. "Certainly, Paul. Our approach to tax policy is designed to encourage domestic investment while ensuring corporations pay their fair share." As she answered, viewers noticed she had closed her folder of research notes and set it aside. Whatever confrontation had been building before the commercial break seemed to have passed. In the production booth, Jack watched nervously as the interview continued in a much more controlled, traditional format. Paul asked standard questions, and Karoline gave standard answers. The electricity that had charged the earlier segment was gone. "Ratings are still spiking," an assistant reported, looking at real-time data. "People are tuning in to see what happened. But they're getting a completely different show," Jack said with a sigh. On social media, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Some viewers praised Karoline for challenging media bias, while others defended Kristen and accused Karoline of being disrespectful. Video clips of the confrontation before the commercial break were already being shared widely. A media analyst posted, "What we just witnessed was a complete reversal of the traditional power dynamic between journalist and subject. Leavitt came, armed with data about NBC's coverage patterns, and effectively became the interviewer herself. In her office, Kristen watched the continuing interview on a monitor, her expression a mixture of frustration and professional concern. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues and friends asking what had happened. She ignored them all. After the commercial break, the interview continued for another 20 minutes, but the remaining conversation was noticeably tame. Paul stuck strictly to policy questions, avoiding anything that might lead to another confrontation. Karoline answered each question thoroughly but didn't attempt to turn the tables again. When the interview finally ended, Paul thanked Karoline and the cameras turned off. The studio staff seemed relieved that the segment had concluded without further incident. As Karoline gathered her things, Nancy entered the studio, barely containing her excitement. "That was masterful," Nancy whispered. "You completely flipped the script on them." Karoline kept her expression neutral, aware that they were still surrounded by NBC staff. "Let's discuss in the car," she said quietly. As they walked toward the exit, several staff members watched them pass. Some looked openly hostile, others simply curious. Greg and Susan stood near the door observing the aftermath of what would surely become a legendary television moment. "Did you see how prepared she was?" Susan whispered. "That folder had everything. Dates, statistics, quotes. She must have spent days getting ready for this." Greg nodded, and Welker walked right into it. They thought they were setting up an ambush, but they were the ones who got ambushed. Outside the building, reporters who had somehow heard about the dramatic interview were already gathering. News traveled fast in the media world, and word of Kristen Welker leaving her own interview was too juicy to ignore. Karoline and Nancy were escorted to their waiting car by security. As they settled into the back seat, Nancy finally let out the laugh she had been holding in. "The look on her face when you pulled out that research. They never expected you to come with receipts." Karoline allowed herself a small smile. "We knew exactly what they would ask. They've been playing the same edited clip all week, so it wasn't hard to prepare." "And now?" Nancy asked, her eyes bright with triumph. "Now we wait," Karoline replied calmly. "This story will develop a life of its own. Our job was to plant the seed to make people question the coverage they've been seeing. We did that." Back at NBC, an emergency meeting of senior producers and executives was underway. Denise Ford stood at the head of the conference table, her expression grave. "We need to get ahead of this," she said firmly. "Social media is calling it everything from a justified walkout to an unprofessional meltdown. We need our response to be clear and unified." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Kristen is one of our most respected journalists. We can't throw her under the bus." "No one's suggesting that," Denise replied. "But we need to address what happened. Viewers saw their trusted anchor walk off during a live interview. We can't pretend that's normal." As the executives debated their next move, the video clips continued to spread online. News outlets were already picking up the story, with headlines ranging from NBC anchor storms offset after tough questioning to political spokesperson turns tables on mainstream media. What had started as a standard political interview had become something much bigger, a moment that people would discuss and debate for days to come. And both Kristen Welker and Karoline Leavitt would find themselves at the center of a media storm neither had fully anticipated. The morning after the interview, the story was everywhere. News channels played clips of the confrontation on repeat. Newspaper headlines highlighted the dramatic moment when Kristen Welker left the set. Radio hosts debated who had won the exchange. The interview had become much more than a discussion about policy. It was now a story about journalism itself. In her apartment, Kristen sat at her kitchen table scrolling through her phone. She had turned down all requests for comments or interviews. Her inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues, some supportive and others questioning her decision to leave the set. The official NBC statement claimed she had been called away to an urgent matter, but few people believed that explanation. Her phone rang. It was Jack Miller. "How are you holding up?" he asked when she answered. Kristen sighed. "I've been better. It's all anyone is talking about." The executives want you to make a statement, Jack said. Something about technical difficulties and miscommunication? That's not what happened, and everyone knows it, Kristen replied. I'm not going to lie. There was a pause on the line. Then what do you want to say? Kristen looked out her window at the city skyline. She had spent 15 years building her reputation as a fair and tough journalist. One difficult interview shouldn't define her career. I need to think about it, she finally said. I'll call you back. Across town, Karoline was already at her office. The interview had made her an overnight sensation in political circles. Her phone had been ringing nonstop with congratulatory calls from allies and interview requests from other networks. Nancy entered her office carrying 2 coffee cups. You're the hero of the day, Nancy said, handing Karoline a coffee. The video has over 5 million views already. Karoline took a sip of her coffee. It's not about being a hero. It's about fairness in media coverage. That's all I was trying to highlight. Well, you certainly did that, Nancy replied with a smile. The network president called our communications office personally. They want to schedule a follow-up interview with proper ground rules. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Interesting. They're worried about the perception that they ran away from the conversation. Exactly, Nancy nodded. What do you want to do? Let's wait, Karoline said thoughtfully. Let this story develop on its own for a few days. We don't need to rush into anything. Meanwhile, media analysts were having a field day discussing what the incident meant for political journalism. Beth Martin, a respected media critic, wrote a widely shared analysis. What we witnessed wasn't simply about one question or one interview gone wrong. It revealed the fractures in our information ecosystem and the challenges of conducting civil discourse when fundamental trust has eroded. When Leavitt came armed with data about NBC's coverage patterns, she flipped the traditional power dynamic. The journalist became the subject, and the subject became the journalist. The article sparked intense debate online. Some readers praised Karoline for holding media accountable, while others defended Kristen and traditional journalistic practices. Midday, NBC's ratings data showed that the controversial interview had been their most-watched segment in months. Executives were torn between concern about their reputation and excitement about the viewership numbers. In a closed-door meeting, they debated how to handle the situation. We need Welker to make a statement, one executive argued. The longer she stays silent, the worse this looks for us. But if she admits she was unprepared for Leavitt's approach, that makes us look bad too, another pointed out. Denise Ford, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. Maybe instead of hiding from this, we should lean into it. What if we do a special segment about the challenges of political interviews in today's environment? We could even invite Leavitt back. The room fell silent as everyone considered this unexpected suggestion. Back at her apartment, Kristen had made a decision. She sat at her desk and began typing a statement. She wouldn't let others shape the narrative about what had happened. After 15 minutes of careful writing and editing, she picked up her phone and called Jack. I'm ready to make a statement, she said, but it will be in my own words. The network might not like that, Jack warned. Then they can find someone else to read their script, Kristen replied firmly. This is my reputation on the line, Jack sighed. Send it to me, I'll see what I can do. Across social media, the debate continued to rage. The hashtag #YoWelkerWalkout was still trending, now joined by #Journalism on Trial and #Leavitt Takes Control. People from all political backgrounds were using the incident to support their own views about media bias and accountability. 3 days after the interview, Kristen Welker appeared on NBC's morning show. She sat across from the host looking composed but serious. I want to address what happened during my interview with Karoline Leavitt, she began. In journalism, we sometimes face moments that test our composure and professionalism. I regret leaving the discussion before it was completed. That was a mistake, and I take full responsibility for it. She paused briefly before continuing. However, I stand by the questions I asked. Challenging public officials is a key part of a journalist's job, even when those challenges are uncomfortable. I should have stayed and continued the conversation, and I will do better next time. The host nodded. Some have suggested Ms. Leavitt came with the specific intention of putting you and NBC on trial, rather than answering questions about policy. How do you respond to that? Kristen chose her words carefully. Every guest has the right to challenge questions they feel are unfair. That's part of the process. But yes, it did seem that she came with a strategy to question our coverage rather than address the policy concerns many Americans have. The interview continued for several minutes, with Kristen neither apologizing for her questions nor attacking Karoline for her responses. She walked a careful line that aimed to restore her professional reputation while acknowledging the unusual nature of what had happened. Later that same day, Karoline released her own statement. My goal was never to create controversy, but to ensure that Americans receive complete information rather than selective snippets. I respect Ms. Welker as a journalist and appreciate her acknowledgement that walking off was not the ideal response. I remain open to having substantive policy discussions with any news organization committed to fair and comprehensive coverage. The statement was carefully worded to appear gracious while still subtly reinforcing her original criticism. It was a masterclass in political communication. A week after the original interview, the ratings data told an interesting story. NBC's viewership had initially spiked as people tuned in to see the fallout, but then began to drop. Meanwhile, Karoline was invited to appear on several competing networks, each promising fair and complete coverage of her views. The incident began to spark broader conversations about media responsibility, interview tactics, and the relationship between journalists and public officials. University journalism programs use the video as a teaching tool. Media critics wrote thoughtful analyses about what the confrontation revealed about the current state of political discourse. For both women, the experience had been transformative in unexpected ways. Kristen became more determined than ever to prove her journalistic integrity, dedicating herself to in-depth reporting that couldn't be dismissed as biased or selective. Karoline found herself with a new platform and increased credibility among those who had long felt mainstream media was unfair to their views. Beth Martin concluded her follow-up analysis with an observation that resonated with many. Perhaps the most valuable outcome of this unusual confrontation is that it forced viewers to think more critically about how they consume news. When the interview itself becomes the story, we're all compelled to examine the lens through which we view political information. In that sense, both Welker and Leavitt may have unintentionally performed a public service, reminding us all to look beyond sound bites and ask deeper questions about the information we receive. 1 month after the famous walkout, NBC announced a new format for political interviews that would include extended time for context and allow for more complete answers. Other networks soon followed with their own format changes. The confrontation that had seemed so dramatic in the moment had actually created space for something unexpected, a small but significant shift in how political journalism was conducted. And it had all started with a folder of research notes and a question about international alliances that never received a clear answer.